Hello everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, back again today for another game analysis video from one of our members. This game was sent to me by a player with the Chess.com username Razor05, who had the white pieces here. Looks like this was a game between a couple of 1,200 players or somewhere in that range, but he did a lot of things that really impressed me. He showed me a game that he lost and struggled with and had lots of questions about. He annotated the game. This was a longer time control game. I think he said this was 30 minutes on each clock. So we have a lot to go over here and a lot to learn from. So let's go ahead and get started. So he opens with e4, his opponent plays e5, knight f3, d6, and here he plays bishop to c4. Certainly a fine opening move. It follows the opening principles of developing a piece, getting you closer to getting castled. Most players here prefer to play d4 and fight for a little more space, but there's nothing wrong with bishop c4. Now after bishop c4, your opponent played this move h6, which is definitely not good. We've talked about this kind of move in a lot of my previous game analysis videos, about how you don't want to waste time in the openings playing these little pawn moves when you don't need to. You really want to be making sure that all your opening moves fight for one of these opening goals, of either fighting for central space, or getting closer to getting castled, or developing your pieces. Here you played d3. Again, nothing wrong with it. I get the feeling a lot of players feel really comfortable in like their little opening setup, or that they're really compact. They've learned the opening principles, and they know they want to get their pieces into the game. But if you're going to get a lead in development, it's a lot of times going to be better to try to fight to open up that center, because if the center doesn't open up, your lead in development, it's not going to count for as much, because your opponent's going to be fairly safe if the position stays closed. So I would play d4 here, especially after my opponent plays this h6 move, wasting time. I would see that as kind of a red flag to open up this position and use my more active pieces to my advantage. Anyway, d3, knight to d7, knight c3. I like how you're developing your pieces every turn. Your opponent played c6, and you did a really good thing here. You asked yourself what your opponent's trying to do here. This is something I talk about in my move-by-move guide to chess thinking, which is available for free, by the way, on my website, chesspathways.com. Always ask yourself what your opponent's move is threatening, and you saw here that your opponent probably wants to play d5 later, and then you did something else really good, and you counted. So many people forget to do this, that you said, okay, I have 3 attackers on this d5 square. My opponent only has 1 defender, so I'm not worried about d5 yet. That's not going to be possible on my opponent's next turn. So instead you continue developing. You played bishop to e3. Your opponent plays a5. And once again, you ask yourself, what is the goal of this move? You didn't just say, okay, a5, that's a silly move. I'm just going to castle. You said, aha, okay, my opponent's threatening to play b5 and a4, and my bishop's going to be trapped. Once again, really good job of asking yourself what the point is of your opponent's move, and being tactically safe and aware. So you played a3, making sure your bishop would not get trapped. I might play a4 here instead of a3, just to stop b5 for longer term, and just not let your opponent get all that space on the queen side. But of course, being aware of your opponent's threat and preventing it with this move a3 definitely deserves to be praised as well. So your opponent plays b5 and expands. You drop your bishop back to a2, and your opponent plays queen to f6. So already, White has quite a significant lead in development. You have 4 pieces developed on good squares, and your opponent only has 2 pieces developed. And one of those pieces is the queen here, which we know usually doesn't develop too early, and here it's blocking the knight from its best square. So White has a lead in development here, and it would be really nice if you could open the center. So you go ahead and castle, always good to do. Your opponent plays bishop a6, rook e1. Yeah, so it's nice that you're really methodically kind of following opening principles. You're getting all your pieces on good squares. You definitely have an advantage. But when your opponent has neglected their development this much, making so many pawn moves, h6, you have all your pieces in the game, you're castled, they're not. Sometimes you got to look for more active approaches to really exploit this, because having a lead in development is really a very temporary advantage. You have to either use it or lose it. So instead of rook e1, what about this plan? What about playing knight d2 and playing f4 on the very next turn? Just opening this rook onto the queen's file. I know rook e1 is kind of your development of the rook, but this would develop the rook too, kind of opening its file here. And black seems to have a little more trouble responding to this. I would feel much less comfortable playing against this if I was black. Just to this immediate threat of opening up all these lines, while I'm still well, maybe more than 2 moves away from getting castled on the king side, because my knight and bishop are tripping over each other for this square. Castling queenside doesn't appeal to me at all, because I've pushed all my pawns over there. So I think if you just play knight d2 and f4 really fast, I think this puts a lot of pressure on black. So just something to keep in mind. When you have a lead in development, always look for ways to exploit it fast, because it goes away if you don't use it. Anyway, you played rook to e1, your opponent played g5. Wow. You respond with d4, that's good, trying to open that center. They attack your knight and play g4, and you retreat that knight and play knight to d2. Now, were you concerned here about the capture of this pawn, or did you look into this and determine it wasn't a threat? It turns out it's okay for you. I don't think you mentioned specifically looking into this line, though. So if you didn't see this line that makes this work out for you, you definitely can't play a move like knight d2, because it looks like you're losing a pawn and getting forked, because you cut off your queen from defending that square. And you probably could have played something like taking here first, right? Throwing in that in-between move. He can't take your knight yet, because his queen's under attack. So just making that exchange and then saving your knight. Now, it turns out, I don't know if you saw this or not, but knight d2 is safe, because if they take your pawn here, you're not actually getting forked. You can actually play e5 and try to fight to open even more lines. Now your rook's getting developed, their queen's under attack, and whichever way they take here, there's going to be some kind of pin, and they're not able to fork your pieces. But if you didn't see that, you definitely can't go for this line. You would have to see that to justify going for this. So after g4, knight to d2, your opponent does not take here. Maybe they saw this idea that they're not actually winning the piece because of e5, when all your pieces come to life. They play h5. Really neglecting their development a lot here. Black's making so many pawn moves in the opening, and most of their pieces are still sitting on their back rook. And after h5, you played f3, and you gave me a comment and said this was really your first big mistake of the game. Yeah, I kind of like f3 in principle, trying to open lines here, maybe trying to open the f-file. But really, there's some big downsides to this move. Now I think your opponent's idea works a little better to take here, because your queen's not able to take this free g4 pawn anymore like it could have been in some lines on the previous turn. I think after takes, you have to play e5 once again. They'll take. You have to take on d4. Now they break the pin with bishop e7. Now you have to retreat your bishop. And things aren't really so clear. Your king's position could get weakened a little bit, and black is probably ready to castle queenside, maybe. Yeah, it's a little messy. I think there's better ways to get an advantage in this position. And f3 is always kind of a risky move to play, although, when you're trying to open lines, you have a lead in development. I can't criticize that. But yeah, you mentioned this move d5 is better, and yeah, I would tend to agree with that. It looks like lines are going to get opened up somehow. At first, I thought black could try to keep everything closed with c5, because if black can keep everything closed, then really it doesn't matter that he's behind in development. He can take all the time he wants to catch up because the position's so locked. But I think you're going to just make enough threats that it's really hard for them to do this. Queen e2 here, attacking the b5 pawn. b4, knight to b5. And you have several threats. You have knight c7. You're not really worried about some pin here. You can always support that knight with a pawn. And your knight could get the nice c4 square. You can try to open things up on the queen side with more pawn breaks. I think the position's going to open up before blacks are ready, before they can get all their pieces into the game. And I think white should have an advantage here. White has more space and the more active pieces. Anyway, after f3, your opponent plays bishop h6. Okay, so now you play d5. They push that pawn to c5. And you play rook to b1. Yeah, instead of rook b1, you mentioned a4. This is actually pretty common in a lot of openings, especially e4, e5 openings when black starts expanding on the queen side. A lot of ways, the way to challenge this is by playing a4. And it just creates squares for your pieces. For example, if they don't respond to a4, you're just able to take on b5 and open a bunch of lines, which also gives the c4 square to your pieces if you want it. If they push, that's not really a concern. Once again, you're going to get access to the c4 square, which two of your pieces would potentially really like. You get to play knight b5 and create some threats, and you're not really worried about them taking. You have double pawns here, but it's not really that big of a deal. You're going to get this open file for your rook, and that's another reason why I don't like moving it to the b file, because there might be some lines where this comes in handy. And rook b1 just strikes me as potentially a little slow. I don't know how effective this idea is going to be, especially when black has ideas to play b4 himself in some of these lines, just as an example. So your opponent plays g3. It's kind of an interesting move. It's a pawn sacrifice, right? I'm not entirely sure I understand, unless they want you to take and try to open the h-file somehow, but I don't think it's really that good of a move. But you don't take. You play b4, and you end up letting them take here later, I saw. Is there a reason we can't just take this pawn on g3? It looks like a free pawn to me. I'm not really sure what the downside is to just taking that pawn. Anyway, though, you went ahead with your idea and played b4. Yeah, I'm not sure how successful this is going to be in opening up lines, though, because they don't have to take twice here. I know you made some comment earlier in the game when you played d4. You said you hope your opponent would take. Here, I'm guessing, again, you're hoping they'll take twice and open up all these lines. Remember, whenever you create pawn tension, there's really three things your opponent can do. They can take your pawn, they can push past your pawn, or they can ignore your pawn and maintain the tension. So whenever you're creating pawn tension, that's kind of a checklist of three things. Try to consider what's going to happen if your opponent does any one of those three things. A lot of players create pawn tension. They immediately start calculating, what's the position going to look like after the pawns get exchanged? But remember, your opponent has the option to push, and they have the option to just leave the tension there. So just a good little checklist of 3 possibilities to check every time you make a move that creates pawn tension. After b4, your opponent exchanged, and they took on h2. So now you no longer have the chance to get this free pawn. Maybe you were worried it would weaken your king if you took on g3, but if you don't, and they take here, doesn't that weaken your king anyway? I'd just always rather have the extra pawn, I think. King to h1. You made some comment here about how you liked using this pawn as a shelter for your king. Yeah, that is a common idea in a lot of lines. Yeah, I can see the merit of that. You said you want to swing your knight around anyway. So yeah, I can understand the logic there. And yeah, here your opponent plays a4. He's kind of not going along with your plan to open up all the lines, just grabbing more space. That's why I would have liked to maybe play a4 myself. Now you play queen e2, attacking the b5 pawn again. You say you're putting pressure on that pawn, but once again, doesn't it look like a really natural move for your opponent to just play c4? Just lock everything up? Like, I think if they play c4 here, our bishop's really shut out of the game, our knights have trouble finding good squares, our queen can't access the queen side, and unless we're ready to make some kind of sacrifice, are we? Can we take on b5 and really try to open up the whole queen side because we're so far ahead in development and black still has undeveloped pieces? We're giving up a piece for 2 pawns. It's worth considering. I'm a bit skeptical, though. You've seen in some of my other videos, a piece is a piece. A piece is a big thing to give up, even if you get a pawn or 2 for it. Maybe this kind of speculative sacrifice is worth considering, but I think black has reason to be happy here after their bad opening, now being at the piece. So if we're not ready to make that sacrifice, our opponent's playing c4 looks really annoying for us. And I don't think from your notes you really made a mention of this. I'm not sure if you weren't aware of the possibility. So I guess 2 big takeaways so far from the game, and there's going to be more later. But 1, when you get a lead in development, you have to sometimes be creative and use it fast, because it goes away if you don't. And 2, remember, whenever there's pawn tension, there's 3 options. Your opponent can push past your pawn, take your pawn, or maintain the tension. So whenever you're creating pawn tension, or whenever your opponent creates pawn tension, always consider all 3 possibilities. Anyway, your opponent plays queen f4, and you say that now you're not ready to take on b5 yet. It's good that you saw this, because your queen would get deflected away from your rook, right? Your queen's kind of needed to defend your rook. So you play knight f1, bringing your knight to its kind of desired square. It looks after the rook, it looks after the weak squares, and potentially will threaten to recapture that pawn at some point. And now your opponent plays h4, really trying to go ahead with this attack, but now they've let you take on b5 and create all kinds of counterplay on the queen side. And I looked ahead a little bit, and it looks like you kind of ran them over on the queen side. So this is a mistake some players make a lot, I've noticed. They think these positions are really a race. They see that you have a weak king, they're kind of behind in development over there, and they just want to race you. If you can take one move, if you can go one move out of your way to really shut down all your opponent's counterplay and play c4 here, yeah, you made a move that didn't further your attack, but you just shut down so much white counterplay on the queen side. You kept the whole queen side closed. Now you'll have a lot more time to just go back and slowly build up on the king side if that's what you want to do. Now black could even maybe castle queen side if they're not afraid of these sacrifices. They'll have to make sure they don't work. But taking one move out of your way here to really shut down a lot of counterplay is a lot better than just trying to race your opponent and say, I'm going to mate you before you break through on the queen side, when all you needed to do was make one move and really slow down white's counterplay. So h4, yeah, so it looks like neither of you really considered this c4 possibility, but it looks really good to me. I still can't see why black wouldn't play that. So, h4, and now you do take on b5. And your opponent takes on b5, and now your queen takes on b5. Yeah, now it looks like you're going to be able to open up this queen side, and that's really good for you. That's kind of where your counterplay lies. Your king's kind of under attack, but black really doesn't have that many pieces in this attack, and if you can open up that queen side, and you're going to be up material, white has very good chances here. So your opponent plays knight to f6, finally developing that knight, which probably should have been developed a long time ago. You take on c5, and they just play king f8. I'm not sure why they don't take back. I think they can take back. B takes c5. If they take, do we have some kind of tactic here? Maybe we just play d6 and really get this bishop back in the game after being, locked out for so long. But I think this is probably preferable for black than just losing a pawn. They play king f8. And now you get to play, well, you can either play c6 or take on d6. I think you mentioned here queen c6 was the move that you saw that the computer gave after the game, but you said you felt your queen would be chased away? Well, I'm not really sure how it can be chased away because this just works tactically, right? It's not really a positional idea, it's a simple fork. You're attacking d6 and a8. and you're going to make further inroads on the queen side, keep winning material just because it's a simple fork. So I think you just missed that little tactic. c6 is very strong positionally, though, creating a passed pawn. Now your opponent just looks like they blunder a piece. They play king e7. Yeah, you can't. Black can't allow this exchange to happen, pawn for knight. I'm not sure why they don't just play knight c5. Maybe they're afraid that their rook will get... Well, no, they can't even play that because the knight's there. I'm not sure why they didn't play knight c5. It seems really natural just to save your knight, and then you can connect your rooks with king g7. And either swing your rooks to the queen side or swing them to the king side, whichever way you want to play, but I don't know why black feels compelled to give up a piece here. Maybe they just forgot somehow that c6 was attacking their knight. So they play king to e7, and you win a piece. Now white is winning. And here I know you mentioned something like you saw you had an advantage now, you really wanted to get after the black king. And I'll just go through some of these moves pretty fast coming up here just so I can make a point about what happens here. So they play rook h to b8. You say you missed some sequence here where your opponent gets queen c1 and starts kind of generating all these annoying kind of counter threats. So just to go back a little bit, after knight takes d7, here you've really accomplished what you set out to do on the queen side. You completely ripped black up on the king side, on the queen side. You have a completely winning material advantage now. You can continue to go after their king. A lot of times that is a good path to take, but you no longer are obligated to. You don't have to do anything on the queen side anymore. You've achieved a winning advantage from your kind of adventures on the queen side. If you want, you can just come back and try to solidify, try to exchange some pieces, try to defend black's attack, and any endgame is going to be winning for you. You've achieved your goal of having any endgame be winning for you. You can just defend if you want, although it is dangerous to get in that mindset of being too passive. I just wanted to make you aware of the possibility. Here it looks like you tried to keep going after the black king. You gave your opponent some counterplay that probably they didn't deserve. If you could have just maybe solidified a little bit and not given your opponent that counterplay, I think it can be avoided. Kind of one good mentality to have whenever you have a completely winning position is just reduce counterplay. It doesn't mean be passive. It doesn't mean you have to, only defend and never try to win anything else because you already have a winning advantage. But it does mean to put kind of reducing counterplay at the front of your mind. Always ask yourself, am I giving my opponent some chance to get back in this game that they don't deserve? I'm kind of going to, adopt this safety first mentality and make sure to reduce my opponent's counterplay. Anyway, rook c3. I think you're still winning after this whole sequence. Rook hb8, queen e2, takes, queen c1. Yeah, you're kind of scrambling together to defend everything. It turns out to work out for you, actually. Your queen kind of is the hero here. Defends all the rest of your pieces. So after queen to c4, your opponent plays queen a1. And yeah, here you play this move f4. And I can't remember exactly what you said about this move. I didn't get this in PGN format, so I don't have all the comments embedded on this screen. I received it through a forum post. Yeah, I think you said something about being low on time here. But as far as your intention here, I'm not really sure what you're trying to achieve with f4. It seems like you're still having this mindset of really get after the black king, but there's no need to do that. You just really have to solidify. Here, you're in this pin. You said that king takes h2 is the best move, and yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. You just simply get out of that pin. Remember, by playing f4, after these pawns get exchanged, this knight could finally get active. This knight could start hopping around into squares like e5. Now, it's still not so simple, because there's all these possibilities for checks. White's still completely winning. But I don't see a reason to make this pawn sacrifice with f4. I'm not really sure what it accomplishes. I would just take on h2. Anyway, after f4, your opponent played rook to c8. So they're sacrificing a rook to win this knight, but I don't think they really are able to break through, are they? I guess let's see the game line, because that's what ended up happening. So you take the rook, they take on f1. So they're down tons of material now. They're down, what are they down? A whole rook and a few pawns. Or no, not a few pawns, just a whole rook. They actually do have some pawns left on the board. But do they really have a perpetual here? So White's certainly not in danger of losing this. This knight is just not going to be able to join the attack in time. If this knight ever tries to join the attack, it looks like you're getting a huge counterattack on Black's king. So there's no way White should lose this. But does Black have a perpetual check here? So after queen takes f4, I'm trying to check this with a computer because it's so hard for me to believe that Black actually has a perpetual here. So if you play king h3, Chess.com's computer is saying that Black somehow makes a draw after queen c1, which isn't even a check. We're really not in time to come defend our king from checks and try to stay a rook up? What if we play queen g8? Oh, now there's queen h1 to worry about. Oh, yeah, because now there's this skewer. Okay, wow. So really, after queen c1, even though that move's not checked, there's really no way for White to make progress. Wow, that's pretty hard to believe. I wouldn't have been able to calculate that out myself, I don't think, in a game, especially under time trouble. Yeah, I guess if you come back, there's still queen to f4, and there's nothing to do but take a repetition. And black was able to make a draw. Okay, wow. Yeah, that's kind of hard to see. But once again, if you got into that mindset of reduce enemy counterplay, I think this definitely could have been avoided. You might have not been able to see this exact tactic, the sacrifice of the rook to get a perpetual check. But if you reduced counterplay and just tried to consolidate, make safe moves, I think we could have avoided this, especially by not playing f4 and simply breaking the pin. Okay, now that should be the end of the video, but you've actually, it turns out you lost this position. So let's see how that happened. So king g1, queen to c1, king f2, queen d2, king g1, queen e1, king h2. Yeah, this should be a draw. The queen cannot mate you on her own. And actually, this queen takes e4 move looks really bad, because that's not check. And isn't white able to get out of the perpetual now? I don't see what the big threat is now. If we play rook to c4 like the computer's showing, yeah, white's winning here. So queen takes e4. Your opponent should have just kept giving checks. I'm not sure why your opponent stopped giving checks. After rook c4, I think there's no more checks here, and white can probably swing around and consolidate somehow and just be a rook up. Anyway, though, after queen takes e4, even though it's not check, you kept moving your king. That indicates to me maybe you're in severe time pressure here. I don't know. And then after queen f5 check, you take on h4, queen f4 check. Yeah, and I think if you just stay back, you're still able to at least make a draw. Instead, you came forward here with king h5, which, of course, unfortunately, just blunders checkmate in 1. But even if you don't see the mate in 1, the last thing you want to do is let this knight join the attack with check. Because if this knight ever tries to join the attack and it's not check, your counterplay is just way too strong. But letting that knight join the attack with check, even if it's not checkmate, that's just extremely dangerous. So it looks here like you were unhappy the game got away from you. I don't know, you weren't satisfied with the draw, which is understandable, but the last thing you want to do is to lose the other half point as well as the first half point and lock yourself into checkmate there. So I think there's really 4 big lessons from this game. This was a great game. Thanks for showing us. The first one is when you have a lead in development, you have to strike when the iron's hot. You have to make use of it, because if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. The second one is about pawn tension. We saw several scenarios in this game where it looks like neither player considered pushing past instead of capturing or just maintaining the tension. Remember, any scenario with pawn tension, whether you're creating it, whether your opponent's creating it, you always have to figure out what's going to happen if your opponent or you captures the pawn, pushes past the pawn, or just maintains the tension and leaves those pawns there. You have to be aware of all 3 possibilities anytime there's pawn tension. Thirdly, once you get a winning position, once you get that winning material advantage, adopting the mindset of eliminate counterplay first, play safety first. You can still be aggressive, you don't have to be passive, but really always being cognizant of your opponent's counterplay and trying to reduce it. Adopting that mindset is going to save you from losing games like this more often than you might think. And finally, fourthly, when things start to go wrong and you had a winning position, you blew it, now your opponent has a draw, some kind of perpetual check, you've lost that first half point, right? You've gone from the whole win, the full point, to now half a point, a draw. The last thing you want to do is to, let your mental state affect you and get the best of you and push too hard and then blunder a mate in 1. Or really any kind of blunder, right? That's one of the hardest things to do in chess, is completely switch mentalities from, okay, I'm winning, how do I convert this to a win, to, oh no, I'm not winning anymore, I have to scramble to make a draw here. It's really hard, even for me, even for strong players. But the more practice at it you get, the better. Just always try to be objective about the position. Always ask yourself those questions. If I make a move, what's my opponent going to do in response to that move? And you probably didn't have enough time on your clock here. I don't know if you played with an increment or delay or not. You said it was a 30-minute game. I don't know if it was 30 minutes with no delay. I would always recommend playing with some kind of delay or increment, just so someone can't just clock you, right? Always makes for a higher quality game to analyze when, you can't just get clocked. You'll always have that delay or increment to save you. But yeah, lots of takeaways from this game. Thanks for the annotations in the game. Hope everyone learned something. I will see you again next time.